Hello everyone, welcome to ASEAN Pacific shows. The topic we are going to discuss today is ASEAN. ASEAN should be the most critical region across the ASEAN Pacific, which is currently gaining geopolitical importance between the two superpowers. One is a global hegemon, United States. Other is a rising challenger, the People's Republic of China. With the growing tension between the US and China, ASEAN countries are increasingly heading towards a place where they will be forced to a choice between the two superpowers. To better understand the condition to which ASEAN dealing with today, first we are going to discuss and we are going to start from the history of ASEAN with my guest, Dr. Peter T.C. Chang. Dr. Peter is trained in the field of comparative philosophy and religion. In recent years, Dr. Chang's research is focused on analyzing the new lease of life ancient philosophical and religious traditions are relishing in modern China. The project looks at how a rejuvenated Confucianism could shape the evolving character of the Chinese milieu and in turn impact the global community multidisciplinary in the scope. The study covers subjects ranging from social political reform in inter-civilization engagements and bioethical issues in environmental concerns. Currently, based at the Institute of China Studies, Dr. Peter Chang at the University of Malaya. Dr. Chang is analyzing the opportunities and risks associated with the Belt and Road initiatives. He's examining this from the perspective of China's soft power, specifically the Chinese traditional as well as popular cultural imprints upon the world at large in general and in Malaysia in particular. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Lokman, for having me.
Peter, can we start, please, with a brief history of ASEAN? Can you tell us a little bit about the history of ASEAN, please?
Okay, ASEAN actually was formed in 1967. It was in the backdrop of the 1960s, the Vietnam War kind of era. And it started off as an anti-communist bloc. It was a common concern about what at that time they perceived was what they call the domino effect, where they saw the rise of the communist order. They saw how Eastern Europe began to fall under the communist sort of sway, and Indochina as well, Vietnam War was at its height, and they were fearing that Laos and Cambodia would fall, and then they could also bring about a fall of Thailand, Malaysia, and the rest of Southeast Asia towards the communist sort of order. So there was this common fear that brought the newly independent countries of Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. These are the 5 founding members of ASEAN to come together to form a bloc. So it essentially was a kind of anti-Cold War, Cold War kind of bloc, anti-communist Cold War bloc, mainly to preserve their own sort of newly founded independence and to maintain their liberal democracy kind of nationhood. So then over time, the ASEAN 5 members expanded to include other states, Brunei and the others eventually come to where we have right now today, 10 member states in ASEAN. Then over the years, they also expanded to what they call the ASEAN plus 3 and ASEAN plus 6. ASEAN plus 3, that is ASEAN that will include China, Korea, and Japan. And then ASEAN plus 6 would include China, Korea, Japan, and Australia, Indonesia, and India as well. So that's a very quick, short break, sort of a history take on the formation of ASEAN.
So how did these Southeast Asian nation states come together and form from ASEAN?
Yeah, essentially it was this common threat that they feared about the rise of the communist bloc. Thankfully, eventually sort of dissipated at the end of the war, the Vietnam War, and then eventually uh, the ASEAN states were able to come and put a stop on that fall. Cambodia fell, but then Thailand stood up. So then eventually the Cold War also died. With the end of the Cold War dissipated, then ASEAN began to turn more into an economic bloc rather than a security bloc as such. Although security remains a very important component in the ASEAN makeup, but over time it functions more as economic bloc.
So, can you give us an overview of ASEAN and relationship with the United States?
Yes, ASEAN's relationship with the United States is a very close one right at the outset because of the Cold War setting. ASEAN aligned itself with the free world, so they saw the United States as a benefactor, supporting them. They shared very closely the free world sort of ideology, and saw United States as an anchor, as a very pivotal provider of the ASEAN security framework. So ASEAN has got very strong historically very strong relationship with the United States.
So, when we're talking about the US ASEAN relationship, how the important was the US in the early decades of the ASEAN ex- existence?
Yes, it was absolutely critical. America played a very important role in providing that security framework. And then eventually, it wasn't just the military component, but the economy as well. America played a very vital role in building up this newly independent post-colonial nations with multinational corporations coming in to provide to set up manufacturing base for the Americans, multinational corporations that really help the ASEAN countries to build their economy as a base, and that became the basis for which the ASEAN countries was able to grow eventually into a strong economic bloc.
Peter, what are the key features define the US and ASEAN relationship?
I think besides military, the security and economy, we also shares a lot in terms of cultural. But because some of us, like for example, Singapore and Malaysia was formerly part of the Commonwealth or the British, so we inherited a lot of the English language cultural aspect, and then also the political model, the parliamentary governing system. And the Philippines also has a much more American form of governance. So we inherited a lot of these legacies from the colonial past. So we share a lot of affinity in terms of cultural, political values with America. So it was quite a comprehensive sort of relationship in almost every dimension, and it has. I think to some extent it continues to be that way. So although as you will see with the rise of China, things have changed a little bit, but overall, uh, ASEAN and US have had very sort of historically strong relationship.
And there is another superpower in the region, China. What is the relationship of ASEANs with China besides the United States?
Okay, ASEAN's relationship, China comes in relatively late in terms of the ASEAN founding because it was United States that was right there at the beginning of the founding of ASEAN. And ASEAN's relationship with China sort of only took shape after 1978, after Deng Xiaoping sort of opened up China to the rest of the world, and there was a lot more interactions between China and with the rest of the world, and that also includes interaction with the Southeast Asian states. So in that regard, us China is quite new in the sense in the modern era. In the last 50 or 60 years, China was in self-isolation for a while. So the rest of the Southeast Asian new countries were not so familiar with China. We were not exactly sure what exactly how would China what would China be like? What is China going to be like in the post-cultural revolution China or post-Mao China? So there were a lot of uncertainty as to what kind of relationship that would be. So vis-a-vis America, China was relatively new. We are not very familiar with China. We are much more familiar with America.
In this context, what were the main drivers shaped ASEAN's interaction with China?
It was primarily economics. In the 80s, when China began to open up, they were actually looking for investment from Southeast Asian countries to be invested in China. They needed help in terms of capital. So there were some of the ASEAN countries like Malaysia or Singapore. They were happy to be part of that economic growth in China. So the main driver at the time was really China needed a lot of input from the rest of the world, mainly from the West, from Europe, from America, as well as from Southeast Asia and Australia. So some of the ASEAN countries took a quite important role in the 80s and 90s in helping China to jumpstart its economy. Singapore, in particular, played a pivotal role in providing itself as a model in which China could look at, in which how to rebuild a city, a post-war city, into a fairly prosperous, metropolitan world-class city that is in Singapore. And the Chinese leaders really took a lot of interest in looking at how that model works for Singapore and how it could replicate it back in China as well. So there was a lot of opening of mutual learning at that time. Chinese were very eager to learn from China and from Southeast Asia, to have input from the Southeast Asian countries, and vice versa. We were also beginning to have a feel for what China could contribute to our own economic growth. But at that time, it was much more one way, in which capital was moving into China. But by the 1990s, the reverse flow began to happen when the Chinese themselves are beginning to look for opportunities for investments elsewhere, and then their market also begin to open, and then that's where China became a potential market for our Southeast Asian produce and products. So the trade began to go both ways, and investments also began to go both ways. So it was primarily economy that drove the relationship, and we have also moved past from a very critical stage, because at the beginning of the founding of ASEAN, there was this concern about the communist movement, and the communist movement at the time wasn't just the USSR and versus US, but there was this China component as well. The Chinese Communist Party had some support of some of the insurgencies, communist insurgencies, for example, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and in Singapore. So there was an ideological sort of difference and sort of enmity between China and the rest of Southeast Asia in the 1960s. But by the 1980s, the Chinese leadership has moved past that stage now. They have moved past that exporting the communist ideology abroad. We effectively closed that chapter, that China no longer presents to us, at least officially, uh, formally, that kind of ideological threat to to our own national sovereignty. So the Malaysian Communist Party also began. The Chinese Communist Party also sort of severed any relationship that they had with the Malaysian Communist Party at that time, which was an outlaw party, and which was sort of fighting a kind of a terrorist insurgency warfare, uh, fairly low intensity, but it officially came to an end after Chinese cut their relationship with that branch of the Communist Party in Malaysia. So that really shifted the relationship. The relationship was no longer defined by ideological differences, but focused mainly on the economy, and the economy became the main driver of the relationship between ASEAN and China.
For example, Peter, how the BRA shaped the ASEAN relationship with the China?
The BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, is a very good example of how that relationship has grown, has matured, and has also become very integrated now. It's a very good project to look at how the scale and the depth of that relationship have grown. The BRI, as most of us would know now, is quite familiar, is a very global sort of undertaking. It's intercontinental. It across the Euro-Asia continent on the Silk Road, the landmass route, and then over the maritime route. It cuts through Southeast Asia into the Hindi Ocean all the way to the Gulf of Arabia and North Africa. So it's a massive project. What's important, Southeast Asia was the launch pad in some ways. President Xi Jinping sort of first articulated the idea in Indonesia at one point. And for us here in Malaysia, it's very historically important because the maritime component of this Belt and Road retraced the steps of the 15th century Admiral Zheng He's Ming Dynasty voyages. That the Ming Dynasty's Admiral Armada sort of sails through Southeast Asia to the Gulf of Arabia. So the modern day Belt and Road maritime component sort of basically retrace that step. So for us here in Malacca, Malaysia, it has got historical significance. It harkens back to the very old historical relationship that China has with the olden days Malay Sultanate in the region. So today, the BRI has become a key component of not only the relationship between the two countries, but it's also the driver of the economic growth for the region. Malaysia itself, we have signed on to quite a number of this big mega infrastructure project. Some of these projects has been, because of the pandemic, has been sort of slowed for a while, and then there were some changes because of the change in political regime. So there was some revision on some of the contracts that we had signed with China. So there were some adjustments that were made in some of the projects, but overall, I think the BRI initiative is still very much alive here in this part of the world, and it will be very significant in defining how Southeast Asia economically would would grow, in what direction it would expand, how it would be shaped over the next at least 20 to 30 years, because the BRI now has taken on many dimensions. It's no longer just the infrastructure like ports, highways, airports, but it has got a digital component to it. E-commerce has become very, very important, the virtual reality world. This artificial intelligence technology has become part of the digital BRI. Then we have the sustainable BRI, where there is an emphasis on making all this project much more environmentally sustainable. And lately, it's the health Silk Road thing that we talk about, especially in the context of the pandemic. It's absolutely important that China is leading that dimension of public health networking in the region, trying to set up sort of infrastructure, public health infrastructure, so that we could not only provide basic health sort of welfare to the folks here in Southeast Asia, but especially in the context of the pandemic, to be able to respond more effectively as and when the next pandemic happens. Component of the BRI, which I'm personally kind of interested as somebody who works in the academia, is what they call it the educational BRI as well, where there is an expansion of network of educational institutions. Here in Malaysia, we have Xiamen University in southern China established their first overseas branch in Kuala Lumpur, and this is probably just the first, and that we are expecting more of this kind of expansion happening. So the BRI is a very comprehensive, all multidimensional, all encompassing kind of project that China is trying to engage with the rest of the world, and also in Southeast Asia in particular, that it wants to be a part of that kind of multidimensional relationship with the rest of Asia. It's very holistic in that way. It also shows that how integrated we are now economically with China. So that relationship is becoming much more interdependent than we anticipated.
And besides this economic connection, there is also a reality growing tension between the US and China in the region. So, what is the in ASEAN's perspective? What is the Sino-US rivalry?
Yes, the US-China rivalry is independent of ASEAN, of course. It happens because China has risen as a power that the Americans have begun to realize quite different from other previous powers that the Americans have encountered, vis-a-vis especially the Russians, the USSR. There was a lot of comparison that this is Cold War II, but they realized that this is not exactly the same kind of arch rival that they saw in the USSR, because USSR primarily was a military sort of a rival. The rivalry was very much at the military front. But China is more so of an economic rival than anything else. But China's rise to stand beside the American is primarily economic rise. Its rise is driven solely as an economic powerhouse. But that itself can be very threatening in some ways and that's how the American feels, because economic power may not present a kind of immediate sort of threat as a military power would, but it could exert significant leverage that could diminish another power's ability to exert their own dominance in other ways. You see. So the US kind of trying to figure out how to respond to this new power that has arisen from on the horizon. And another difference, obviously, is that it has got a very different civilizational background. China is the rise of a power that has got a very different philosophical, religious sort of belief systems from the West. The West in general, a Judeo-Christian worldview, and then the Chinese have got more of a Confucian sort of worldview. So that also creates another layer of uncertainty because of the unfamiliarity or dissimilar kind of worldview that they represent. Okay, so we see this happening now, and for us here in ASEAN, uh, we know that this is being played out not only along the shores of China and the US, but it's along the region. It's mainly played out right now in the Asia Pacific region. China doesn't really has that ambition or not the capacity to be a global hegemon right now. It certainly begin to has its sort of flexing its muscle within its neighborhood, which is here in Asia Pacific and in Southeast Asia. So yeah, we feel that. And the other thing that comes to my mind about this rise of China, the Sino-US rivalry, is this a lot of talk about how the 21st century will be the Asian century. So it also reflects a kind of a beginning of a shift of dynamics in terms of global geopolitical uh, power center that the 20th century or the 19th century or 18th century was very Western centric. The world revolves around the axis that is defined by the West. But we beginning to see that beginning to shift a little bit now, more towards Asia in some ways. And the rise of China is part of that shift, I think. And we're beginning to shift, and then the rise of China also helps not only to sort of add some dynamism within Asia itself. Asia itself will become the region that may also begin to define how some parts of the world would be governed, or will also have some influence in shaping the world order. So these are the sort of broader sort of changes that we are seeing within the Sino-US rivalry, and with all of these changes, there will always be an element of risk and also an element of possibilities. It will bring about new changes, something new that could be exciting. But with these changes, there will also be risks that will bring us to uncharted territory. So we have to be both optimistic and also somewhat cautiously optimistic that this change will go without too much stress put onto the world order. Yeah.
Peter, in this context, I would like to ask how the Sino-US rivalry affecting the ASEAN's relationship with these two superpowers.
We are feeling a pain because, as I said, historically at the beginning we have very close relationship with the Americans. We have same political values in some ways. We share the same political system outlook, and but with the rise of China, we also feel that we need China. China is our permanent neighbor. China is with us. China has historically been with us, geographically been with us. China will always be there. America, where else, is relatively new to us in terms of the long 2,000-year history. America is a relatively new friend, and whether America will be with us in the foreseeable future, we still do not very sure. But in the short term, America has been very important to us. So we really want to see that the two powers are able to coexist. In the ideal world, where we want to see that eventually we know that there is this transition period that the two big powers needs to get to know each other and then to figure out each other's strengths and weaknesses and then to find a way to coexist. And we do hope that they will be able to find a way to coexist.
I would like to add more question. What is the ASEAN's response to the Quad and the Indo-Pacific strategy?
That it ties into this idea, this ASEAN sort of general hope that the two powers could coexist, and this is how we see Quad and the Indo-Pacific strategy as something that is antithetical towards that aspiration that the two powers could coexist, because we see this as part of the containment strategy to want to contain the rise of China. Although the folks who are in Quad and Indo-Pacific says is not what it's supposed to be. They do not intend to contain China, but it's hard to believe that it is not so when China itself is not invited to join the Quad or the Indo-Pacific. So ASEAN, up to now, as far as I know, there is no one member of the ASEAN states have openly said that they would join Quad or nor join the Indo-Pacific strategy, because they see that as countervailing to what the ASEAN hope was, that the two superpowers will find a way to coexist, and they don't see Quad and Indo-Pacific strategy as leading to that kind of coexistence.
Some ASEAN countries and members or have adopted not taking side strategy. Can you explain, please, some context in this neutrality strategy? How is this related to the historical non-alignment movement?
Let me just start with the historical non-alignment movement. Historical non-alignment movement has got a very important meeting in 1957. They call it the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. And some of the leading leaders of the newly independent post-colonial states, like the Egypt leader Nasser, and then Premier Nehru from India, and Zhou Enlai from China, and a few of the President Sukarno from Indonesia, and they came out to found a non-aligned movement, meaning they do not want to take sides. That was immediately after the USSR and the US post World War II Cold War kind of tension, when the worlds are becoming divided between the free world and the communist world, and the new aligned movement did not want to take sides in this Cold War divide. So we see this sort of happening in some ways when the ASEAN says that we don't really want to take sides, as if they want to stay neutral. It harkens back to the days of the Bandung conference, I think, to stay neutral, to become non-ally. But as I explained early on, the founding of ASEAN wasn't non-ally at all, wasn't neutral at all. It was very, very anti-communist. It didn't want to be part of the communist bloc. ASEAN was founded as a very partial ally movement that is to be on the free world side, to want to take a stand against the communist world. Okay, so it wasn't impartial when it comes to the Cold War, communists and the free world. Okay. However, today the tension between China and the US is to us, to ASEAN, is no longer the Cold War ideological sort of divide between the communist world and the free world, because China, as I said earlier, no longer, export is communist ideology now. China has made it very clear that they don't see their model as for someone else. It says that the Chinese model is only for the Chinese model, and we don't intend to export it, to impose it upon anyone else. But however, if you are interested, you are very welcome to look at us, and if you think it is suitable for you, you are very free to adopt it if you wish to. But we are not in this same kind of liberal democratic crusade to want to liberal and democratize the rest of the world. They say that they don't have this ideological mission to want to export their specific kind of ideology, as opposed to where the West is right now in terms of insisting that countries need to adopt the liberal democracy movement. So they don't see that. The Chinese certainly don't see, and Southeast Asian in general understood that. We don't see this to the extent that we frame it as a Cold War right now between US and China. We don't see it as an ideological Cold War. Okay, we are not asked to choose whether to adopt communism as an ideology or to adopt the liberal democracy as an ideology, because we are not. China doesn't put us in that position to choose. So that's the difference. And so when the ASEAN says that they do not want to take sides, it's a very pragmatic, much more pragmatic response. Basically, ASEAN realized that it needs to coexist with both powers that are beneficial to us in different areas of our existence. Okay? China is absolutely important for us at the economic dimension. We cannot afford to alienate or decouple ourselves from the China economic live stream. It will be disaster for us. So we will have to continue to maintain connection economically with China. But at the same time, we share the political values that we had with the West, with the liberal democratic world. We want to maintain that. We are not too excited about the authoritarian model that the Chinese state has, but we want to continue to be able to maintain the liberal democracy that we have adopted from the West. So that's basically it. We just want to be able to operate in that realm. Of course, we have some territorial disputes with China in the South China Sea, but we don't see that as an existential threat that would eventually, lead to a full colonization of our own territory by China. China doesn't have the same kind of colonizing ambition as the Western imperialism had. Southeast Asian countries are familiar with that. So the Zhenghe story is a very good story in that sense that my hometown in Malacca has a history of that. When Zhenghe visited my hometown in 1410, it was a Malacca Sultanate. He visited my hometown about 4 times in 1410 to 1445. Then he left, and the Ming Dynasty armada left, retreated to China. Then in the 1510, about 8 decades later, the Portuguese came, and the Portuguese colonized, completely destroyed the Malacca Sultanate. They took over the whole place, and that began 2 centuries of, but 5 centuries of European conquest of the Southeast Asian Malaya. We have historical memories of that. We do not see the Chinese as that kind of colonial powers. We do have territorial disputes at the South China Sea with the Chinese, but we do not think that needs to be that would lead to that kind of outright colonization that the West West had. So it's a little bit more nuanced now in terms of our reaction to China. We don't see China as completely benign. There are some, as any big power, they would exert their power. We need to be able to hedge ourselves. And then, but we also see that we need to be part of the China economic sort of orbit in order to remain viable ourselves as sovereign states or viable economies. And I think there is a lot of benefit. And then the ASEAN states are somewhat pragmatic. We are not so ideologically driven, I think. Of course, I cannot speak. Cannot say that ASEAN states all respond uniformly. Every ASEAN state has their own nuances and distinctions. The Philippines and the Vietnamese would have different response to China as vis-a-vis Malaysia and Indonesia. But I think collectively, I think most of us would want to see that the two powers are able to coexist without us having to be forced to take sides. I must say that the Chinese themselves, as far as I know, that I've heard the articulation is that they don't really want to force us to take sides either. They say you are very welcome to work with anybody that you want, provided that you don't work with them to contain us. Meaning, they say that you are very happy to have any naval exercises or cooperations with the Australians or the Americans or the British to protect your own territory or to secure your own borders, but don't cooperate with them solely because you want to contain China, and that would not be in the interest of China. It's the other side that we tend to hear. The Americans would probably are much more eager for us to make a stand as to where we are vis-a-vis the two powers. Um, the Chinese seem to understand that we need to not to take sides, but the Americans seem to think that you have to take sides. Otherwise, you are not making your stance clear in this world of black and white thing. Good and bad guy. There is no room for middle. You have to take sides. You have to make your moral positions clear. Whereas we don't always see eye to eye on that kind of black and white sort of dichotomy. We feel that the world is not so clear cut. There are a lot of grays in between, and I think there is room for us to move around the grays as well. Yeah.
Yes, Peter, I would like to ask my last question about what is your assessment on the current dispute in the South China Sea, and what will be the ASEAN's response to the growing the regional crisis or the conflict between the US and China?
Yeah, we are very concerned with what's happening in South China Sea. As I said before, Malaysia has some disputes with China over some of the islands. We were a little bit disappointed and concerned with how in the last few months there was some incursion by the Chinese Air Force into our airspace, and there have been reported sort of skirmishes in some of the contested waters. Malaysia has registered our disappointment with China. And having said that, as I said earlier on, we do not feel that this is a dispute that need to be resolved solely by military means. There can be ways in which this can be resolved. This can be resolved through diplomatic ways, and the diplomatic ways has not been fully exhausted yet. So we feel very concerned when there is a military build-up by forces outside of the region and outside of the parties that are immediately involved to want to heighten up the tension in within the South China Sea itself. We are very worried that it could lead to unforeseen circumstances or misreadings by either party that could lead to events that could go out of control. We remain committed to want to find a way in which we can resolve this peacefully, diplomatically, and in almost every context that we have with our Chinese counterpart, we made it clear to them that please, we need to find a way in which to resolve this conflict in a diplomatic means. And I think the way forward is we are still working on the code of conduct thing. The Chinese side are still trying to map up a way in which we could find a way to have understanding on how in which we could respect each other's claims. We may not be able to solve all the claims, but is there a way in which we can reach some compromises? So that's between us, individual ASEAN countries with China. But what's beyond our control is the other powers that has taken an interest in it. They identify themselves as a stakeholder in this dispute as well. And we are very worried that this Southeast Asia could turn into a theater of war, of a proxy war or a proxy big power war. And nobody wants to have a war that is not their own, that is fought by others in their backyard, because the consequences will be very bad for all of us. So we are pleading that the big powers of China and the others that would be able to share the concerns that we have. Southeast Asians are very concerned. We have seen wars before, wars that were fought by others in our neighborhood, wars that are not our own makings, and then we become the sort of we are caught in the middle. We become the collateral damage of this kind of war. So we have got. I personally find it hard to understand why other powers would want to come in to intervene in this. There are disputes that we have with China, but I think there are ways in which we can solve it without resorting to that kind of military posturing that we are seeing right now in the South China Sea. So I think overall, on the whole, I think the ASEAN relationship between US and China is this. I feel that we really, deep down in our heart, we really want to see that we can coexist. We have benefited a lot from the United States. We have benefited from their protection in the 1960s and 70s against the communist sort of push, so that we can continue to maintain our liberal democratic form of governance. United States has been very helpful to us as newly independent country to help us to rebuild our country from the post-colonial years. And many of us have quite successfully built our economy thanks to the generosity of the Americans' help in the 70s and 80s. And we share many values with them because of our background, our education, the common language that we share, like English, for example. A lot of us are trained in the West. I personally was trained in America. So I have a very great understanding and appreciation for what the West can offer. But at the same time, I also realized that China is so important to us now. China is a power that is overall has been a positive power to us. China has economic power, has done its own share of miracles, the way in which China has lifted its 2/3 of its population from abject poverty, which has never been done historically. And this is something that the rest of Southeast Asia, where still a significant part of our population is still struggling to get out of poverty. And I think China's model has something to offer to us. The Belt and Road Initiative, it's a very good one. It will bring us a lot of economic good and economic uplift. We don't share the same political system or political value as the Chinese. And the Chinese understands that. The Chinese don't want to impose their values or political system on us. And they hope that we will be able to, despite the differences that we have in our political system and values, that we could work together at the economic level, to help eradicate poverty, better our public health system, pursue economic growth that is much more economically, environmentally sustainable. These are all universal values that I think, even though we may have different political order or system, these are all humane, universal values that I think ASEAN shares with China as well. So I feel that it is kind of I hope that this is just a transition right now between the US and China, that they will eventually be able to find that common meeting place, that they will be able to know each other well enough now to accept each other's differences, and then to be able to coexist. And that will really benefit many of us, the middle countries and the small countries that is caught in the middle. And ASEAN, for example, is a very, very good example of that. And we are trying our very best to navigate through this very tricky period. And as the title of the talk says, ASEAN does not want to take sides. And it's true. It's not just a cliche. It's just not a sort of giveaway catchphrase, but it really is. Deep down in our hearts, we want to be friends with both. And we believe that we should and we can be partners and friends with both of the superpowers.
It is a really very difficult position for ASEANs to taking
It
side
is.
or not taking side. Thank you very much, Dr. Peter, for joining me today and for your knowledge and conversation about the ASEAN geopolitical position between two superpowers.
Thank you, Lokman. It's wonderful to have this conversation with you. Thank you again, Lokman. Take
You're
care.
welcome. Thank you very much. Please, dear audiences, also, thank you very much for joining us today. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel for next programs.